Imagine a 16-year-old boy locked in the luxurious chambers of an emperor, where his innocence becomes a tool of power. Did you know that in the majestic halls of ancient Rome, the fate of young bodies was decided as if they were relics? Throughout the centuries, few civilizations exercised such cruel control over desire as ancient Rome. Its borders stretched from the misty British Isles to the scorching sands of North Africa, and in the labyrinthine imperial palaces there existed a hidden world. A world of male lovers and concubines, whose history long remained beyond the official chronicles. These young men, most often captives or descendants of impoverished families, replenished the harems and chambers of the powerful, becoming symbols of wealth and status. They were not simply slaves. They were bought and sold like rare coins, put on display or hidden in the shadows in the hope of avoiding public condemnation. In Rome, sexuality was measured not by gender, but by role in the act. The active participant was associated with dominance and masculinity, while the passive participant was associated with shame. This is why young male concubines, who were obliged to obey the desires of their masters, faced humiliation at every turn. They were often brought back from military campaigns. Conquered Celtic or Germanic tribes would often leave one teenager in each wealthy family. Sometimes parents themselves sold their sons for a pittance, hoping to survive or gain political favor. Once in the owner's house, the young men rarely had a happy fate. They could be castrated to preserve their freshness and beauty, and were handed over to private tutors or mime actors to be taught the art of flirting. The law of Julius and Papias, passed during the reign of Emperor Augustus, officially recognized the right to legal status as a concubine, only for free citizens. But male lovers had almost no legal status. They remained unmarried and had no rights whatsoever. Castrati, incidentally, sometimes managed to gain a certain autonomy in the imperial houses of the East, especially after Nero's reforms. But in the heart of Rome, their numbers were small. Stoic philosophers of the time, such as Seneca, openly condemned such practices, considering them a waste of human nature. But the voices of theorists rarely reached the ears of aristocrats bent on luxury. Young concubines were masterfully trained for service. They were taught the art of seduction, dancing, playing the lyre, and even Homer's epic poems, all to entertain their masters. But no talent or melody could save them from total subjugation. They had no right to refuse, no freedom of choice. They were turned into living decorations at banquets, serving as a backdrop for the grandeur of emperors and senators. At the same time, displaying overly passionate behavior outside the palace was punished with shame and condemnation. Roman moralists and tribunes did not forgive excess sensuality, especially when it came to overly young bodies. There are many references in history to male lovers in the upper echelons of society. The most famous is Antinous, a young man of Greek origin and the favorite of Emperor Hadrian. He was only 19 when he died under mysterious circumstances on the banks of the Nile. Some sources call it an accidental drowning, others a ritual sacrifice to secret cultists. After his death, Hadrian proclaimed Antinous a god, erected statues in his honor throughout the province of Achaia, and even established a festival, but this did not bring the young man's voice back. In the cult's aftermath, Antinous' beauty became part of the imperial myth rather than a testament to human feelings. Unlike Antinous, many concubines did not even leave their names behind. Their fate was an endless succession of masters, excessive passions, and the cruel shadow of loneliness. Historians believe that there could have been several thousand of these young men at any one time throughout the empire. They worked as concubinae, a room of torture and pleasure created to maintain power. Private letters found in Herculaneum and Pompeii contain complaints such as, "I am like a toy in the hands of a mischievous god," or "not a single tear is heard." But they had no power. Concubines were neither legal spouses nor even lovers in the full sense of the word. Rather, they served as living trophies. In the political landscape of the empire, having a beautiful passive partner was an asset. It demonstrated the power and influence of the family. A concubine belonged not only to the flesh, but also to strategy. He could become a gift to an influential senator, a tool for blackmail, or even a hostage in dynastic intrigues. If it was necessary to strengthen friendship with the Greek aristocracy or secure the loyalty of the eastern provinces, a young man in gold bracelets was presented as a symbol of mutual understanding. Today, as we admire the monuments and frescoes, it is worth remembering that behind the facade of the eternal city lay a machine of humiliation and exploitation. The history of male concubines teaches us how much is the human body worth when it is used as a tool of power, and how far can an empire go when it preys on the vulnerable spirit of youth. Looking at this page of the past, we see not only the dark side of Rome, but also a ghostly reflection of our own history. For control over desires remains one of the most powerful mechanisms of power at all times. Thousands of young bodies were turned into silent currency for political intrigue. Behind the gleaming marble facades of Rome lay true horror. In a world where lineage, reputation, and appearance decided everything, children became hostages to dynastic games. A handsome young man presented to the bedroom of a senator or magistrate strengthened family ties, guaranteed loyalty or punitive mercy when needed. There was also a formal ban on the public corruption of citizens, the Scantini law, but it was rarely enforced, and accusations against influential experts in power were nipped in the bud. Most often, these were captives from conquered provinces, Thrace, Bithynia, Judea, or Gaul, but sometimes Roman patricians also fell victim. Sons of impoverished families were given into the care of a noble patron. Roman patrons called this kind of upbringing guardianship, but behind the screen of respectable care lay unequal and long-lasting sexual ties. Male concubinage among the elite was an open secret, supported by social hypocrisy. Historians Tacitus and Suetonius pointed out that the virtue of a Roman citizen was determined not only by military bravery, but also by the ability to dominate others in bed. An active role symbolized dominance, while a passive role was considered shameful and lowly for a free Roman. But a special unspoken code applied to concubines. They embodied what was publicly condemned but considered a refined pleasure in private chambers. These young men were often subjected to physical and psychological abuse from an early age. Although castration was not a mandatory procedure, it was often used to preserve a high voice, delicate skin, and childlike facial features. Becoming a eunuch meant losing not only the chance to continue the family line, but also civil rights, marriage, family, inheritance, and official protection under the law. At the same time, they were taught music, lyrics, poetry, and dance. They had to captivate their patron not only with their bodies, but also with their minds, becoming indispensable companions and entertainers at society parties. In essence, they became luxurious companions, deprived of the right to choose. When their beauty began to fade, their value fell as rapidly as gifts at the market. Outdated eunuchs were sold, sent to hard labor, or simply left to the mercy of poverty. There was no social space for them. They were neither spouses, nor full citizens, nor ordinary slaves. Their presence was both omnipresent and invisible, in lavish villas, at banquets, in baths, and in the private letters of aristocrats. Even in public baths, or the shady gardens of wealthy owners, people whispered about them, competing to see whose concubine was more beautiful, more obedient, more refined. An underground market operated. Catalogs of bodies passed from hand to hand without any possibility of defending their right to life. From surviving references, we know of Apete, the secret lover of the orator Cicero, who is mentioned in passing in his letters, and Helios, the favorite of Emperor Nero, whom the latter forced to play the role of a bride in cruel parody weddings. In many cases, these young men did not even understand what was happening to them. They were kidnapped from their native villages and immersed in a foreign language, customs, and the logic of the Roman world. What seemed chic and elegant to their clients was a psychological prison for them. Some succumbed to their fate, others resorted to quiet resistance, refusal to eat, chronic illness, or voluntary death. In an empire renowned for its rationality, the laws of Julius and Papias, and the grandeur of its forums, there was no place for compassion for those who were considered mere instruments of pleasure. And this moral abyss remains one of the darkest secrets of ancient Rome. The marble arches of the Colosseum and the grandiose aqueducts hide the cries of silent victims, young bodies turned into instruments of power. In ancient Rome, temples were built, aqueducts were erected, and the Colosseum itself was constructed. But no one wrote a law to protect the boys who worshipped imperial luxury. Their voices and their pain simply did not fit into the marble idea of greatness. However, echoes of their existence can still be heard today. This is a story about the same system that has been repeated for centuries in different cultures, about the commodification of the human body and the justification of violence by the power of authority. First of all, it is striking how the fate of these boys depended solely on the aesthetic taste and whims of their master. They were not considered individuals, but were called delitiae catamidi, pueri, that is, delicate, favorites, or simply babies, depriving them of any maturity or free will. The word stuprum, a crime against morality but not against the exploitation of the concubini themselves, already appeared in ancient lexicons. Officially, their existence was not illegal. On the contrary, it was part of the imperial tradition, where the head of the family, and even more so the emperor, had power over everything at his disposal. Historical writers such as Suetonius, Tacitus, and Juvenal occasionally made bitter remarks in their works about the presence of adolescents at court. Juvenal, for example, in his satirical poems, fiercely mocked the feasts of the corrupt elite, where boys were forced to parade naked or participate in perverted games. But these lines were not written out of sympathy for the suffering adolescents, but out of horror at the decline of Roman virtue. Sympathy for the individual gave way to fear for morals. Thus, in the annals of these concubini, they remain somewhere on the sidelines of history, neither heroes nor martyrs nor villains, but simply shadows. But their role in politics and society turned out to be much more significant than one might have thought. Often, young favorites achieved high trust. Some became secret advisors in state affairs. Others became invisible manipulators, influencing the minds and decisions of the most influential people. This inevitably gave rise to envy and intrigue. Rivals whispered about the cunning of the marble beauties and sought pretexts for their expulsion or even murder. A striking example is the story of the young Espartero, who was brought from the eastern provinces as a slave and became the favorite of a noble magistrate. Rumors circulated that he was so skilled at managing financial documents and accepting gifts from influential senators that he essentially ruled behind the scenes. When tensions reached their peak, he was brutally murdered. It is not known for certain whether he really wielded enormous power or was merely a figurehead used to appease the ambitions of the nobility. But his death demonstrates how often concubini were both victims and key players in the great game of the empire. The most shocking case was that of Ispur, a boy whom Emperor Nero not only made his favorite, but also ordered to be castrated, dressed in imperial robes, and presented as his late wife, Poppaea Sabina. The colorful crowd at the forum watched as he sat on the throne, and the emperor addressed him as the resurrected Poppaea. This was not an act of love, but a gruesome illustration of senseless, capricious power. After Nero's death, the faceless young man was inconvenient for those around him, and he was forced to commit suicide. The official chronicles were full of laughter and irony, but behind this mask lay complete agreement with the madness of power. In the visual arts, Roma concubini often appeared in the frescoes of Pompeii or in the mosaics of the first centuries BC. They were depicted as slender, beautiful, with perfect features, but the reality was much harsher. Their bodies were commodities, and the smiles on the walls were merely a reminder of how convenient a slave looks under the artist's ideal brushstrokes. In the lower strata of society, where those captured in war or bought in the markets of Alexandria and Carthage ended up, the fate of concubini was even more hopeless, without the right to hope or pity. And yet their fate forces us today to see history not through the eyes of victors and rulers, but through the prism of those who were considered merely accessories to the ambitions of others. For somewhere beneath the majestic arches of the eternal Capitol, the silent cries of innocent bodies still echo, and we have no right to ignore them. The grandiose columns of Rome sparkle in the sun, but deep in the stone heart of the city lie silent cries and gloomy corridors. The empire's greatness was based on fear and lawlessness. There were no lavish villas or merry feasts in the Roman camps, only dark barracks, cellars, and huts. There, amid soldiers' greatcoats and the clang of iron, high-ranking officers reserved for themselves the right to possess young bodies as their property with impunity. There were no witnesses or laws regulating such relationships, only a black mass of flesh and institutionalized violence. Some boys managed to escape this hell alive. Others disappeared without a trace, nameless graves outside the city walls, as if they had never existed. It is important to remember that the concept of consent simply did not exist in the Roman world. Slaves had no free will, and half-blood concubines, whether enslaved or formally free, lived under such pressure that any nod, gesture, or silence was considered consent. It was a culture of enforced silence. Those who dared to break it were threatened with flogging, poking with nails, branding, and even crucifixion, for the master's will was law. Thus, the weight of the state's pleasure machine fell on the simple human body. As Rome expanded its borders from the Italian peninsula to the shores of Egypt and Gaul, it simultaneously honed its internal system of control and exploitation. The relationship between master and slave was not only economic and military in nature, but also deeply personal, intimate, and carnal. The Roman domus was not just a place to live. It was a microcosm of the empire, where the same power structures were repeated. Inside large houses, male concubines became indispensable cogs in this machine. They were not listed in the family tree, never inherited anything, and were mentioned in wills only as objects to be transferred. They were hardly mentioned in funeral rites and rarely buried with honors. They were valuable, but had no history of their own, gliding silently through marble corridors, always alert, always on guard. They were expected to be sensitive to their master's slightest whims. They had to know when to speak and when to disappear. The slightest disobedience resulted in public disgrace or exile. And yet many learned to survive. Intelligence and attractiveness became their only shield and sword. They skillfully read their master's emotions, played on their insecurities, and gave affection, masking their helpfulness as friendly attachment. Such subtle psychological strategies are rarely found in dry chronicles, but it was precisely these that allowed some concubines to preserve their lives and relative freedom. Sometimes complex emotional ties developed between slave and master, not a romance in the modern sense, but a mixture of dependence, ritual, and necessity. In a world where violence was commonplace, a small act of tenderness, even if tinged with power, became an oasis. For some concubines, a barely perceptible caress without subsequent punishment was their only consolation. Others even hoped for pardon, adoption, or at least long-term protection, and this made them resign themselves to reality. But the stability of such a union was fragile. The mood of the master changed, a new favorite appeared, court intrigue flared up, and a person found themselves thrown out onto the street, disgraced, and unable to reintegrate into society. Some were sent to distant provinces to be presented as gifts to new governors. A few, but still only a handful, managed to use their proximity to power as a springboard. They acquired real estate, wealth, and even obtained positions below middle management in the domus or administration. But behind all this, there was always fear. No concubine was sure of her place. The master's favor changed as quickly as the wind over the Tiber. Social norms were hypocritical, and time was the worst enemy. With the passing of the years, youth faded, and in a culture obsessed with youth and beauty, that meant the end was near. The body lost its elasticity, the face its freshness. Many tried to capture the favor of their masters by repeating familiar gestures and the scents of oils and incensum that reminded them of their first days of service. Others resorted to cosmetic mixtures of olive oil, copper powders, and red ochres, which promised to preserve their appearance for a couple more seasons. And the most desperate gave way to new young slaves, allowing their brothers in misfortune to serve in their place, just so they would not become useless. Thus, the vicious circle of oppression continued. The victims became executors in the system, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of being forgotten and discarded. And while Rome prided itself on its great history, it continued to compete in the art of power over the lives of others. A grim and inhuman art, but one that is underappreciated by modern chroniclers. Have you ever wondered who the boys sitting next to Roman patricians at their luxurious tables really were? In ancient Rome, concubines, young men kept for pleasure, often became not just playthings, but secret agents. Their invaluable proximity to their masters turned them into unwitting witnesses to conspiracies and family secrets. Senators distrusted these young men more than even free slave administrators. And for good reason. Rumors circulated about how concubines poisoned rivals, forged wills, and ruined the lives of influential people. But behind the myths lay a much more prosaic reality. These young men were bound by a network of oaths of loyalty, where the word silence meant survival. Roman religion did not directly condemn male love, but society strictly required that citizens act only as dominants. Any deviation from this norm was met with ridicule, suspicion, or public scandal. Therefore, concubines were both desired and despised. They embodied forbidden attraction, hidden passion, and a subtle violation of the rules. Their existence exposed the contradiction between respectable rhetoric and human passions. Some Stoics, including Seneca in his letters, condemned the transformation of young people into objects of lust as contrary to virtue and self-control. But their voices sounded subtle against the backdrop of a centuries-old tradition that approved of pleasure as a natural part of power. Martial's epigrams and Juvenal's satires repeatedly pointed out this hypocrisy. What remained behind the scenes was approved, and anything that accidentally spilled out into public was punished. The system worked smoothly. Violence, when institutionalized, was considered a normal part of political and family life. Most Romans saw nothing immoral in a consul having a concubine or several. It was not a crime. It was the architecture of power, where violence and intimacy merged into one. As Tacitus wrote about Domitian's court, when private matters came to light, they immediately became a pretext for political attacks, but remained an unshakable practice in themselves. The lives of concubines were not reflected in triumphal speeches or marble inscriptions. Their stories surfaced only in Senate squabbles, behind-the-scenes gossip, or Juvenal's scathing satire. No one wanted to acknowledge their contribution. They were silenced, like a disgraced piece of jewelry. Nevertheless, concubines lived with every noble family. The Julii, Claudii, and Flavii all had their favorite boys. If the relationship remained discreet, it was treated with leniency. But if it was mentioned in the forum, it was immediately used as a weapon against a political rival. Archaeological finds only hint at their presence. Frescoes where a scantily clad young man sits comfortably on the lap of an adult. Mosaics with playful scenes of erotic entertainment. Small vases depicting a Greco-Roman erotic game between an older and younger partner. All this existed and was at the same time carefully hidden under a layer of symbolism. In the imperial palaces, the role of concubines was even more significant. Emperors, as living symbols of absolute power, could afford excesses that were inaccessible to mere mortals. Caligula's court was famous for its orgies, where young people of both sexes were forced to entertain guests. Tacitus and Suetonius tell of Domitian, who secretly kept several teenagers while condemning licentiousness in public. This hypocritical morality emphasized that anything that remained in the shadows could exist with impunity. Cruelty and exploitation of young bodies were the norm in Rome. And perhaps this is where the main tragedy lies. When violence becomes institutionalized, it becomes almost impossible to eradicate it. They remained blind participants in other people's intrigues, invisible pawns in a political game, doomed to an endless shadow where their voices were heard neither in the tribunes nor in the temples. But their presence, quiet, hidden, and constant, is forever woven into the fabric of the greatest empire of the ancient world. How did a 14-year-old teenager feel, torn from his native village and turned into a toy for adults by the will of the powerful? His voice disappeared forever. Only marble statues and names polished by history remained. In ancient Rome, there was a world where the personality of a young concubine was pushed into the background, first by power, then by art. We do not know of a single letter from these boys, not a single sincere confession. Their experiences, fears, and even desires dissolved in the will of their masters, who could dispose of their fate as slaves. But let's try to imagine. A 14-year-old boy from a Celtic village or a small Asian settlement moves to a villa near Rome, where slave accountants watch over his bed, and the owner of the villa, an elderly patrician, considers him his pleasure and status symbol. In Rome, strict hierarchies permeated everything. The paterfamilias ruled the household. Wives, children, slaves, even guests were subject to his will. A citizen was above a proud slave concubine. The Senate and the courts regulated land disputes, but the private lives of noble families remained beyond the reach of outsiders. Sometimes concubines were granted a more secure status than ordinary slaves through a special contract, concubinatus. But for subjugated teenagers, this contract meant only secure power over their bodies and minds. The Romans were accustomed to seeing sex not only as pleasure, but also as a tool of influence. Whoever could use another's body with impunity asserted their power. On the streets of Pompeii and Herculaneum, archaeologists find frescoes depicting young men on the shoulders of massive men, a tribute to the same logic, and in the highest circles this was repeated in real life. If a nobleman can dictate his own rules even in the intimate sphere, then he is a true ruler. One of the most striking examples was Emperor Hadrian and his young lover, Antinous. Historians call him the patron of youth, but they forget that before that he was a stranger, subject to the emperor's whims. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 185 BC, According to one version, during rituals in honor of Isis, Hadrian did not simply mourn, he elevated the young man to the rank of a deity. Coins bearing his image, temples and shrines appeared in all corners of the empire, from Alexandria to Smyrna. But the choice to turn Antinous into a god did not belong to him. Historians argue whether the unfortunate young man died as a result of an accident, committed suicide, or was even sacrificed. And yet we will never know who he really was, what moved him, what he dreamed of under the murmur of the Nile. This story was repeated over and over again. Concubines were left without the right to tell their own story. Their lives were rewritten at the whim of the powerful. Some glorified them as heroes of love legends, others as decorations for noble baths and drawing rooms. At the same time, there was not a single memoir, not a single sincere confession, not a single sigh, only stone, bronze, and the pens of historians and chroniclers busy with the business of power. Why was Rome so particularly cruel? Because it built its entire civilization on order and laws, aqueducts, roads, codes, gifts to the world. But these same codes were permeated by the principle that another's body is a tool. Male concubinatus became not just a sexual arrangement, but a public statement. This is my superiority. This is my status. This is my right to dictate norms, even in bed. Now, it is important not to fall into condemnation by modern standards or into justifications of historical context. This is not about cliches of percentages of innocence or percentages of cruelty. We must look more closely. Hear the whispers of those whose lives were devoted to the fantasies of others. Their stories are not just a curious page of antiquity, but a reminder of how far the cult of power over the body can go. And every time we examine this topic through the centuries, we restore a lost piece of their dignity, at least as symbolic justice. Did you know that in the glittering palaces of ancient Rome, young men were turned into living statues, deprived of the right to grow up? Imagine, a thin, transparent tunic clings to your body. The light scent of flowers and spices masks the real smell of skin, and your every gesture, step, and glance is controlled by your master. These young slaves were called Delicia Domini, the Lord's favorites. They walked through the halls in the company of senators and military leaders, like living decorations for which entire fortunes were paid. The higher the status of the master, the more exquisite the fabrics, the finest linen from the Middle East, rare dyes from Phoenicia, gold threads shimmering in the light of torches. But this glittering fairy tale concealed a cruel reality. They were prepared for their role as ideals of beauty from childhood. They were forced to delay puberty using painful methods, and some young men were castrated to permanently preserve their soft voices and smooth skin. The operation was performed with hot iron tongs, which stopped facial hair growth and prevented the muscles from strengthening. Those who suffered from hormonal imbalances lived in constant fear of losing their value. At the slightest hint of a beard or a deepening voice, they were immediately replaced by someone younger and more obedient. Despite the auspices and complex laws of Roman law regarding slaves condemned to lifelong service, escapes were rare. And if someone did manage to slip away from the villa, society greeted him with cold contempt or pitiful condemnation. The former favorite did not fit into any profession or community. In the provinces, from the British Isles to the shores of Africa, there was no shelter, no work, no sympathy, only scars on the body and memories of shame. Sometimes fate smiled. A select few remained with their masters, not as lovers, but as trusted servants. They were appointed stewards or keepers of secrets, given the title of major domo, and learned to consider caresses and orders as equivalent. But even in such an honorable position, it was impossible to forget the past. Every time a guest admired their delicate features, they understood that the image they had captured was still stronger than their own personality. Such emotional and physical slavery left an indelible mark on the culture of Rome. At school, Martial admired the obedience of young slaves in his epigrams, and in his letters, Pliny the Younger enthusiastically described the delicate young men who adorned receptions at villas. Juvenal's satirical texts contain scathing remarks about how the Romans cherished fresh beauty at the expense of human souls. These lines show that the exploitation of beauty was felt in every sphere of life, from baths and thermal baths to imperial receptions. And the most disturbing thing is that this ancient model of power through beauty was passed down from generation to generation. The Romans not only erected a pantheon of gods and sculpted marble temples, but also bequeathed the idea that harmony is unnecessary and only silent obedience is important. Beneath the gleam of marble and engravings lies a bottomless pit that we often gloss over when we talk about the classics. Nevertheless, even in the darkest labyrinths of this mechanism, there were cracks. Some daredevils risked their lives by planning escapes or even poisoning their masters. A few young slaves made it to distant provinces where they started all over again under new names. Their stories have reached us in fragments, almost legends, but they remind us that human dignity sooner or later breaks free. When we admire the marble columns and praise the names of Augustus and Trajan, it is important to remember that behind the luxury and order were real people who had been turned into decorations. The system of male slave lovers was not a random anomaly, but an integral part of the Roman power machine, a symbol of absolute control, and at the same time, a secret that people were afraid to remember. After all, to see the real voice and flesh behind the image of decoration was to look into the eyes of Rome itself and feel how fragile the line between greatness and tyranny was. Imagine a luxurious Roman palace where a young man in sumptuous clothes can become desirable, but in an instant, doomed. His closeness to the emperor made him an object not only of passion, but also of mortal fear. In ancient Rome, freedmen who were lovers of the emperor held a unique but extremely dangerous position. On the one hand, they were granted special privileges. They attended lavish forums and banquets, studied music and literature, wore fine togas made of the best linen and silk, and were valued for their refined manners. But each of these favors only increased their value in a world of power and intrigue. Their bodies became currency, a bargaining chip, and their very identities became a battleground between the court, the Senate, and the ambitions of those close to them. Many paid with their lives for the trust placed in them. Secret conspiracies or strange ceremonies in the palace dungeons turned into bloody sacrifices. Sometimes young men were castrated in the hope of securing their loyalty or making them part of magical rituals, as practiced by the priestly eunuchs in the cult of the Great Mother, the Magna cult of Cybele. But more often, castration was just a mark of shame, the final nail in the coffin for any hope of freedom. The most striking example is the fate of Narcissus, a freed slave and favorite of Emperor Claudius. In 48 AD, he achieved unprecedented influence. He effectively controlled the Senate, distributed positions, and even influenced the emperor's marriages. The chronicles of that time mention that Claudius valued Narcissus so highly that he bore his name in his documents alongside his own. But this trust proved fatal. Accused of conspiracy, Narcissus was arrested, publicly executed in the Field of Mars, and then his name was erased from all official records, a tradition known as posthumous glory, but in the opposite sense. This lesson made it clear that the privileges of these young men had clear boundaries, and any excess of power was punished without mercy. However, the role of a court lover differed from the fate of ordinary slaves and free citizens. They could not enter into a legal marriage. Even if the emperor secretly promised his word of honor, they were denied full citizenship, deprived of inheritance rights, and forbidden to speak in forums or hold public office outside the court. In everyday life, they were ridiculed in the streets. Their light gait, lack of beards, and thin waists marked them as strangers to the townspeople. Insults and ridicule followed them wherever they went. Some tried to unite. They formed secret communities around the fountains of lovers' villas, or met at night at the shrines of the goddess Venus, sharing their experiences and supporting each other. But constant denunciations, persecution by the police, and the cruel label of apostate prevented such alliances from lasting long. The only people they could trust were those who stood next to the walls of the emperor's private chambers. But even there, few felt safe. Roman religion, although it was full of different cults, had no place for pity for such people. The main rituals were dedicated to maintaining order and the greatness of the empire, not to compassion for violators of social norms. There were no special celebrations for them in the sanctuaries of Jupiter, in the pagan mysteries of Dionysus, or in the temples of Isis, except for a few cults of Eastern origin, where eunuchs were regarded as priests and castration was considered a sacred sacrifice. Nevertheless, even there, they most likely remained on the sidelines, victims of their situation. This contrasts with the story of Antinous, the young favorite of Emperor Hadrian. After drowning in the Nile in 130 AD, he became a living deity. He was deified, and temples were erected to him from Carthage to Pergamum. But even in this case, Antinous remained a symbol of the ruler's love, not a full-fledged personality. His biography has come down to us through poetry collections and inscriptions, but we know only fragments about thousands of other privileged slave lovers. And yet, echoes of their fates have been preserved in literature, epigrams, and the visual arts. Idealized portraits of young eunuchs on the frescoes of Pompeii, mentions in the poems of Galen, and enthusiastic lines by poets such as Martial and Juvenal. These fragments help us piece together a mosaic of their lives, between praise and condemnation, luxury and oblivion. Ultimately, the history of Roman court lovers is not just a series of cruel fates. It is a reminder of how power can corrode souls and turn people into puppets of a system where beauty and culture merely mask exploitation. Their bodies and destinies became hostages to ambition and political intrigue, and castration symbolized the ultimate deprivation of freedom. But even in these conditions, some managed to leave their mark in myths, temples, and our memories. Their stories are a call for caution and humanity, when power and passion intertwine in a deadly knot of authority. Imagine the corridors of the imperial palace, where the quiet footsteps of a boy concubine are lost in the cold haze of marble. How many of them pass through there and never return to the outside world? The cult of these young bodies was in many ways a continuation of the absolute control that Rome established over the most vulnerable. These young men, often captured on the borders of the provinces, were sold in slave markets and became dependent on the will of powerful patricians and the emperor himself. Under Nero and Caligula, the practice took on a particularly monstrous intensity. It was not just a matter of complete submission, but a kind of ritual in which concubines became symbols of power, like the mythical Ganymede in the hands of Zeus. However, the thousands of voices of those who were deprived of their names and faces were never heard. Their names were not carved in marble, their portraits were not recorded in the annals, and their dreams and fears dissolved behind the closed doors of palace chambers or in forgotten corners of the eternal city. This historical void compels us to look beyond the official chronicles and reconstruct the subtle, sometimes cruel, intertwining of power and sexuality in Rome. The lives of these young men cannot be reduced to a construct of violence. Yes, beatings and humiliation were real, but where hierarchy reigned, complex emotional ties also emerged. Some of the concubines developed unspoken attachments to their masters, tenderness mixed with dependence, and cruelty with rare moments of compassion and sympathy. Such relationships show how difficult it is to understand the line between love and domination, where power permeated all spheres of life. The influence of these practices was felt far beyond the palace bedrooms. It affected culture, political intrigue, and how Romans perceived their own bodies and sexuality. During the rise and fall of the Eternal City, social norms were adjusted to justify acts that we would today consider atrocities. When we reflect on this page of history, we are not just looking back. We see that mechanisms of exploitation and domination remain in our own time, albeit long since disguised and cloaked in legal and moral pretexts. But if we are able to restore the destinies of the boy concubines, to give them back their voices and dreams, even if only symbolically, we will be closer to a more humane understanding of the past and the present. Behind each of these bodies was a person with their own hopes, fears, and desires, and it is precisely respect and justice that help build a society in which there will no longer be room for such a dark side of power.